A beggar finds a wealthy woman injured with a suitcase full of money. Days later, she searches for him, but didn't know that. In the heart of the city, amidst the pouring rain and the glow of faint streetlights, a lone figure moved through the shadows. He was a man forgotten by the world, middle-aged and weathered by life on the streets. His clothes were threadbare, clinging to his body like a second skin, damp from the unrelenting rain. Each step he took seemed to echo his loneliness, the cold seeping through his bones. He was accustomed to the feeling of isolation, having long given up on human connection. But tonight, something was different. As he walked past a narrow alley, something caught his eye, an unusual sight that made him pause. Lying in the darkness, a woman, barely conscious, was sprawled on the wet ground. Her clothes, once elegant and expensive, were torn and stained with blood. The rain mixed with the red, creating a grotesque canvas on the pavement. At her side was an open briefcase, its contents spilling out in the form of crisp banknotes. His breath caught in his throat as he realized just how much money was lying there, exposed and vulnerable like her. For a fleeting moment, he thought of taking it. The briefcase alone held more than he had ever seen in his entire life. But something about the woman's fragile state made him hesitate. The sound of the rain against the pavement seemed to grow louder as the man stood over her, torn between greed and compassion. His instincts, honed by years of surviving on the streets, screamed at him to take the money and run. No one would know, no one would care, least of all her, a stranger. But then, against his better judgment, he crouched down beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he checked for a pulse. She was alive, but barely. He could feel the faint rhythm of her heart beneath his fingers. The realization made his own heart race, not from excitement but from the weight of the decision he now faced. He could leave her here, take the money, and vanish into the night without a trace. Or he could help her, a woman who clearly belonged to a world far different from his own. The choice should have been simple. His life had been one long lesson in self-preservation. Yet, there was something in her pale, bruised face that stirred a long-buried sense of humanity within him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt responsible for her. As the rain continued to fall, soaking through his clothes, he made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. With great effort, the man lifted the unconscious woman into his arms. Her body was limp, almost weightless, as if the life had been drained from her. The briefcase remained on the ground, but the man couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. It wasn't just the money, it was the mystery that surrounded it. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why had she been left in such a vulnerable state, with a fortune by her side? Questions flooded his mind as he struggled through the rain, her frail body cradled in his arms, the briefcase swinging by his side. The city's hospital was not far, but every step felt like a marathon. His feet slipped on the wet pavement, and his muscles burned from the weight of his burden. Still, he pushed forward, driven by a strange mix of determination and confusion. What was he doing? He, a homeless man who had lost everything, was now playing the role of a savior for someone who probably had never given a second thought to people like him. The irony of the situation was not lost on him, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to safety. As he approached the hospital's entrance, the fluorescent lights reflected in the puddles at his feet, creating an eerie glow. He stumbled inside, his wet clothes dripping onto the pristine floor. Nurses rushed to him, their expressions a mix of alarm and confusion. He laid the woman down on a gurney, stepping back as the medical staff swarmed around her. No one asked him any questions, and for that, he was grateful. Without a word, he turned to leave, the briefcase still clutched tightly in his hand. But as he walked away, the weight of his actions began to settle in. He had saved her life, but at what cost? The briefcase in his hand represented everything he had ever wanted: a way out, a fresh start, a chance to escape the streets forever. But it also represented something darker. The woman he had just saved was not just a stranger, she was a symbol of the life he had lost, of the people who had passed him by without a second glance. The temptation to keep the money was strong, stronger than he had anticipated. Yet, something inside him whispered that this wasn't over, that there was more to this night than met the eye. As he stepped out into the rain once more, the man couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line. He had done something good, something selfless. But the briefcase in his hand told a different story. It was a reminder of the choice he had made, a choice that was not yet finished. The night was far from over, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. He glanced back at the hospital, wondering if he would ever see the woman again. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not from fear, but from the unsettling realization that their fates were now intertwined. As he disappeared into the darkness, the briefcase felt heavier with each step. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The rain, once a cold and unforgiving force, now seemed to whisper secrets in his ear. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what would he do next? The city stretched out before him, vast and uncaring, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger. Something he couldn't yet understand. Despite everything he had been through, the man couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility that had taken root in his chest. Back on the streets, the briefcase clutched tightly in his hands, he found himself unable to open it, unable to touch the fortune that could change his life. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, and he realized that taking the money wasn't the simple solution he had once imagined. As the rain eased, he found shelter beneath an old overhang, watching as the night slowly passed by. The temptation remained, but so did the memory of the woman lying helpless in the alley. The man's mind churned as he thought about the woman's condition. He had done the right thing by getting her to the hospital, but guilt gnawed at him for keeping the money. It wasn't the money itself that disturbed him, but the circumstances surrounding it. How had she ended up like that? Who had hurt her, and why had they left her with such a large sum of cash? His thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together the puzzle, but nothing made sense. Every time he considered spending even a single bill from the briefcase, he felt a strange sense of dread, as if doing so would unravel something he couldn't yet see. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the woman remained unconscious, her body slowly healing from the trauma she had endured. The doctors worked tirelessly, stabilizing her condition and waiting for her to wake. They had no answers to the questions swirling around her mysterious appearance. As the hours passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. Who was she, and why had she been left for dead with a briefcase full of money? The staff could only speculate, whispering to each other as they tended to her wounds. They had no idea that the man who had saved her life was still out there, struggling with his own inner battle. The streets, now quieter with the first light of dawn, offered the man no peace. He found himself retreating further into the shadows, hiding from the weight of his own conscience. The briefcase, still unopened, felt like a ticking time bomb in his possession. What if someone was looking for it? What if someone had seen him? The paranoia began to eat away at him, but even more unsettling was the realization that he cared about the woman's fate. He hadn't walked away after all, not really. His mind kept returning to her pale, bruised face, and the question that haunted him the most: why had he helped her? Days passed, and the man remained hidden, torn between disappearing with the money or returning it. The briefcase could change his life, but at what cost? He found himself wandering near the hospital again, though he never went inside. He couldn't bring himself to face her, to see if she had survived, and yet, he couldn't stay away. It was as if an invisible thread tied him to her fate. Each night, he passed by the hospital's entrance, staring at the glowing windows from a distance, wondering if she was awake, wondering if she remembered anything from that night. Inside the hospital, the woman began to stir. Her memories were fragmented, broken by the trauma she had endured, but certain images flashed in her mind. The alley, the rain, the sensation of being lifted off the ground. Her heart raced as she tried to piece together what had happened, but the details remained just out of reach. She remembered pain, fear, and then, nothing. The doctors reassured her that she was safe now, but her mind couldn't rest. Someone had saved her, that much she knew, but who? And why had they disappeared without a trace? As the woman slowly regained her strength, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing. The hospital staff told her about the man who had brought her in, but they had little information beyond that. She asked about the briefcase, but no one had seen it. Her mind raced with possibilities, and though her memory of that night was hazy, she knew she had been carrying something valuable. The missing briefcase troubled her, but not as much as the thought of the man who had saved her. Whoever he was, she owed him her life, and the thought of never being able to thank him left her with a deep sense of unease. Back in the shadows of the city, the man's thoughts mirrored hers. He couldn't forget about her, no matter how hard he tried. The briefcase remained unopened, untouched, as if it held not just money but something far more dangerous. He wrestled with the urge to flee, to start over somewhere far away, but the pull of the woman's fate kept him rooted in place. His act of compassion had sparked something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. And now, it seemed, he was stuck in the middle of a story that wasn't finished. The man's sleepless nights grew longer as he realized he couldn't run from this. He had saved her life, but the consequences of that decision were beginning to unravel in ways he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know what to do next. Should he return the briefcase? Should he leave the city entirely? Or should he confront whatever truth was lurking behind the events of that night? The questions piled up, and with each passing day, the weight of his choices grew heavier. His compassion had set something in motion, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what came next. The loop of uncertainty pulled him deeper, and as he watched the hospital from afar, he knew that this story was far from over. The briefcase, the woman, his past, everything was converging into something bigger than him. His decision to help her had changed the course of both their lives, and though he didn't know it yet, the answers he sought were tied to a past neither of them could escape. Several days had passed since the woman's recovery, and though her body was healing, her mind remained restless. The flashes of memory from that night haunted her, the dark alley, the rain, the fear. But most of all, the figure of the man who had carried her to safety. She didn't know his name, had barely glimpsed his face, but she couldn't let go of the need to find him. He had saved her life, and the weight of that fact pressed on her like a heavy burden. She had to know who he was, why he had disappeared without a word. The woman began her search quietly, not wanting to alert the wrong people to her vulnerability. She contacted the hospital staff first, hoping they might remember the man who had brought her in. The nurse on duty that night described him vaguely, a man of medium height, bedraggled and soaking wet, but otherwise unremarkable. That description could fit anyone, she thought, but it was a start. The briefcase still nagged at her thoughts. It was missing, and though she was thankful for her life, the money inside had been significant. But more pressing than the cash was the mystery of the man. Why had he saved her? And where had he gone? Despite her wealth and resources, the search for a nameless man in the city's underbelly was far more challenging than she had anticipated. She hired private investigators, scoured surveillance footage, and interviewed potential witnesses from that night, but every lead led to a dead end. Yet, she refused to give up. As fragments of her memory began to return, she became more convinced that this man wasn't a random passerby. There was something familiar about him, something buried deep in her subconscious. She couldn't place it, but the feeling lingered, pushing her to continue her search with renewed determination. Unbeknownst to her, the man had been watching from a distance, just as she had begun searching for him. He stayed hidden in the city's shadows, trying to blend into the background of a world that had long forgotten him. But he couldn't escape her. Every time he thought about leaving the city for good, something held him back. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the fact that their encounter had stirred something inside him, something long buried. He knew she was looking for him now, he could feel it. The thought terrified him, but also intrigued him. What did she want from him? And why couldn't he let go of her either? As the days turned into weeks, the woman's investigation finally led to a breakthrough. A security guard at a nearby building had seen the man carrying her through the rain that night and had remembered his face. It wasn't much, but with this new description, the investigators were able to narrow down their search. They soon discovered that the man had been seen frequenting a certain part of the city, a rundown area known for housing the homeless and those on society's fringes. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the news. This man wasn't just an ordinary bystander. He was someone from the streets, someone who had risked everything to save her. Her curiosity now burned brighter than ever. What kind of person, living in such desperation, would turn down the chance to take her money and run? Why had he helped her instead? As these questions consumed her thoughts, another, more disturbing realization began to form. Could he be someone from her past? Someone connected to the life she thought she had left behind? The coincidences were starting to feel too strange to ignore. She didn't just want to find him to thank him, she needed answers. She had to know if there was more to this story than a simple act of kindness. The man, on the other hand, had been keeping an even lower profile since he realized she was searching for him. He had started sleeping in different places every night, moving around the city like a ghost, avoiding areas where he might be recognized. But no matter how hard he tried to escape, his thoughts kept circling back to her. He knew she was close. Every day, the tension built inside him like a storm waiting to break. He had her money, and that alone was enough to put him in danger. But there was something deeper pulling him toward her, something more than just guilt. As the woman's search intensified, she began to piece together fragments of information that felt strangely familiar. The investigators uncovered an old connection, something buried deep in the financial records of her family's past. Her heart raced as she read the reports. It couldn't be a coincidence. The man who had saved her might not be a stranger after all. Her mind raced with possibilities, and she realized with a chill that the answers might be tied to a betrayal long forgotten, one that had shattered lives, including her own. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with her. The first time they met face to face again wasn't as dramatic as she had imagined. She found him in a park, sitting on a bench, staring at the ground as if lost in thought. He looked older than she had remembered, more worn, but there was no mistaking him. She approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. When he finally looked up and met her gaze, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was as if, for a brief moment, time had stopped. The world around them disappeared, leaving only the weight of their shared history, one she was only just beginning to understand. In that moment, everything changed. The woman realized that this man, this stranger who had saved her, was no stranger at all. He was connected to her in ways she couldn't have imagined. The feeling of familiarity that had nagged at her for so long now made sense. As she stood there, words failed her. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the look in his eyes told her that the answers would not be simple. He knew something that would shatter the fragile peace she had built in her life. Years before he became a ghost in the city streets, the man was someone else entirely. He had once been a respected businessman, wearing expensive suits and holding a high position in a company that was on the verge of great success. His days were filled with board meetings, negotiations, and handshakes, the kind of life that felt distant now. Back then, he had it all, a promising career, a family, and the admiration of his peers. But the world he knew began to crumble the moment betrayal struck, shattering his carefully built empire and sending him into a downward spiral. The betrayal came from someone he had trusted deeply, a business partner who had once been his closest friend. Together, they had built a company from the ground up, sharing the same dreams of success. But greed had wormed its way into their partnership. The man had never seen it coming, his trust had been blind. One day, he woke to find that his partner had drained their accounts, leaving him with nothing but debts and ruined contracts. The shock was enough to shake him to his core. Overnight, he went from being a respected figure in his community to a man with nothing, forced to watch as his life crumbled before his eyes. As the man's world collapsed, so did his personal life. The shame and humiliation of his failure drove a wedge between him and his family. His wife left him, taking their children with her, unable to bear the weight of his downfall. He tried to fight back, to rebuild what had been destroyed, but the damage was too deep. The betrayal cut through him like a knife, not only ruining his career but also stripping him of the people he loved. Alone and drowning in debts, he lost everything: his home, his dignity, and eventually, his will to keep going. For years, he wandered the streets, a broken man with no direction. He became one of the countless faces in the crowd, invisible to the world. The city, once a place of opportunity, became his prison. Each day felt like a battle just to survive, and each night, he fell asleep with the memories of his past haunting him. He learned to live with nothing, scraping by on the margins of society. But no matter how far he fell, the pain of betrayal never left him. It festered inside him, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He had given up hope long ago, resigned to a life of anonymity and misery. The woman had no idea that the man who saved her was once connected to her family. Through flashbacks, it became clear that the betrayal he suffered wasn't just financial, it was personal. The business partner who had ruined him was none other than her father. Years ago, her father's actions had destroyed this man's life, and the consequences of that betrayal had rippled through both their worlds. The man, once her father's trusted friend, had become an enemy in the shadows, though she had never known it. Now, fate had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances, and neither of them was prepared for the truth that was about to surface. As the woman continued to search for the man, she unknowingly dug deeper into her own family's past. Old records and business dealings that had been long buried began to resurface, revealing a history of greed and deceit. Her father's reputation, once untouchable, began to crumble in her eyes. The more she learned, the more she realized that the man she sought wasn't just her savior, he was a victim of her father's ambition. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She wondered how she could face him, knowing the pain her family had caused. The man, for his part, had never forgotten the role her father played in his downfall. Over the years, as he wandered the streets, he had nursed a deep hatred for the man who had taken everything from him. But seeing the woman lying helpless in that alley, he had been reminded of something else: his own humanity. Despite the bitterness that had taken root in his heart, he couldn't leave her to die. In that moment, she wasn't her father's daughter, she was simply someone in need. It was an act of compassion he didn't fully understand himself, but it had set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could stop. As the memories of his past flooded back, the man found himself torn between the person he had been and the person he had become. He had spent years hating the world, blaming others for his misfortune. But helping the woman had sparked something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was faint, barely a flicker, but it was there. Yet, as he grappled with these emotions, the weight of his past was impossible to ignore. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and the thought of confronting her with the truth filled him with dread. The connection between them was undeniable, even if she didn't know the full story yet. As the man sat alone in the dark, his mind raced with the memories of the life he had lost. The woman was a living reminder of everything that had been taken from him, but she was also an innocent in all of this. He couldn't bring himself to hate her, despite everything. The truth, however, loomed over them both, threatening to break the fragile bond that had formed between them. And as the past and present collided, he knew there was no escaping the inevitable confrontation that was coming. The man's story was far from over, and now, with the woman unknowingly tied to his fate, the stage was set for a reckoning that had been years in the making. The ghosts of his past were closing in, and soon, both he and the woman would be forced to face the painful truths that had been buried for so long. The question that lingered was whether they could survive the weight of those revelations or if the past would destroy them both. The moment the woman found the man, emotions flooded the space between them. She had spent days, weeks even, trying to track him down, and now here he was, sitting in front of her. But instead of relief, an overwhelming sense of tension hung in the air. The man barely met her eyes as she thanked him for saving her life. Her gratitude was genuine, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity and suspicion. She had questions, so many questions. Most of all, she wanted to know why he had disappeared with her briefcase and why he had stayed in the shadows ever since. The man, for his part, remained silent, his expression a mask of restraint. As she spoke, the flood of memories came rushing back, memories he had buried for so long. She wasn't just some random woman he had saved, she was tied to everything that had broken him. The weight of the secret he had carried for years pressed down on him like a physical burden. His heart raced, knowing that the truth would soon come out. He had hoped to avoid this moment, to keep their lives separate. But now that they were face to face, there was no escaping it. The past, like a slow-burning fire, was ready to engulf them both. When she finally brought up the briefcase, the man's hands tightened. It was a symbol of the conflict between them, a literal and figurative representation of the divide that had kept them apart. She asked why he had taken it, her voice careful but insistent. Her face, still bruised from the night she had been attacked, reflected both gratitude and confusion. But beneath the surface, the man saw something else, shame, perhaps? Or maybe a hint of recognition. He knew it was time. He had kept the truth hidden long enough. As she looked at him expectantly, he could no longer hold back. With a voice roughened by years of hardship, he finally spoke. He revealed that her father had once been his business partner, a man he had trusted with his future. But that trust had been shattered when her father betrayed him, leaving him bankrupt and destroying his life. The words fell like stones, heavy and unforgiving. The woman's face paled as she listened, the truth cutting through her like a knife. She had known her father wasn't perfect, but this was something else entirely. Her father's betrayal hadn't just ruined a man's life, it had set off a chain of events that had led them both to this moment. As the truth sank in, the woman felt her world shift beneath her feet. She had spent her whole life sheltered from the darker sides of her father's business, but now, those shadows were coming to light. The man before her wasn't just a stranger, he was a victim of her family's greed. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the father she had known with the man who had caused so much pain. She had always believed her father's success had been earned, that his wealth was the result of hard work and ambition. But now, she saw that it had come at a cost, and that cost had been this man's life. The revelation ignited a storm of emotions between them. The man, still seething with years of anger and betrayal, struggled to contain his bitterness. He had lived with this hatred for so long that it had become a part of him. But now, standing before her, he saw the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't her father, and yet she bore the weight of his sins. The woman, on the other hand, felt torn between loyalty to her family and the undeniable truth of the man's suffering. How could she defend her father when the evidence of his betrayal was standing right in front of her? And yet, how could she reject the man who had given her life, who had saved her when no one else could? The confrontation that followed was raw, emotional, and laced with years of unresolved pain. She tried to apologize, but the words felt hollow, like they could never be enough. He didn't want her apologies, he wanted justice. He wanted the life he had lost, the family he had once had. But deep down, he knew that no amount of money or apologies could fix what had been broken. The more they spoke, the more they realized that there was no simple resolution. Their lives had been intertwined by forces beyond their control, and now, they had to decide what to do with the truth that had come to light. As the intensity of the moment built, the briefcase between them took on a new meaning. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about power, about trust, and about the choices they had to make moving forward. The man could keep the money and walk away, taking his revenge on her family in the only way left to him. Or he could give it back, choosing to let go of the past and start anew. The decision weighed heavily on both of them. The woman, feeling the weight of her family's sins, found herself at a crossroads as well. Could she trust him after everything? Could she trust herself to make things right? The man stood, his body tense with the weight of his decision. His eyes, once filled with anger, softened as he looked at her. She wasn't her father. She hadn't been the one to betray him, to leave him on the streets. But still, her presence reminded him of everything he had lost. He could feel the pull of vengeance, the desire to take what he believed was rightfully his. But there was something else, too, something quieter, but stronger. He had already saved her life once. Could he find it in himself to forgive her, to let go of the hate that had consumed him for so long? As the silence stretched between them, both knew that the decision made in this moment would change everything. It was no longer about the money or the past. It was about what kind of future they wanted to create. The secret was out, and now there was no turning back. Both of them had to face the truth, not just about each other, but about themselves. And in that truth, they had to decide whether to let the past define them or to forge a new path forward, together or apart. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of the past pressing down on both their shoulders. The man stood, the briefcase at his feet, staring at the woman who was now so intricately tied to his suffering. His mind raced with the decision that lay before him. Should he take his revenge for all that had been stolen from him, or should he choose the harder path of forgiveness? His entire life had been consumed by bitterness and rage, emotions that had fueled his survival on the streets. But now, face to face with the daughter of the man who had ruined him, he found himself at a crossroads. The woman, still reeling from the revelation of her father's betrayal, looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. She could feel the gravity of the moment, the unspoken choice that would define both of their futures. Her father's sins had stained her life in ways she hadn't realized until now, and the guilt was almost unbearable. She wanted to make things right, to offer some form of redemption for the wrongs her family had committed. But she also knew that words alone couldn't undo the damage. She could only hope that the man standing before her would find it in himself to forgive, though she feared he would choose vengeance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain outside tapped softly against the windows, a quiet rhythm that contrasted with the storm of emotions inside the room. The man's thoughts were a whirlwind, images of his past flashed before him, his old life, the betrayal, the years of struggling just to survive. He thought of all he had lost, all that had been taken from him by her father's greed. Every part of him screamed for justice, for payback. It would be so easy to take the money and disappear, to punish her family by leaving them with the guilt of knowing they had destroyed him. But then, something shifted inside him. As he looked into her eyes, he saw something unexpected: remorse, vulnerability, a reflection of the pain he had carried for so long. She wasn't the one who had betrayed him. She hadn't been part of the decisions that had ruined his life. In fact, she was just as much a victim of her father's actions as he had been. She had grown up under the shadow of a man who had built his empire on lies and deceit, and now she was paying the price for it. The realization hit him hard, breaking through the walls of bitterness he had built over the years. The woman stepped closer, her voice soft and trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't know what my father had done to you." Her apology was sincere, though she knew it might not be enough. She didn't expect forgiveness, not after everything he had endured, but she had to try. The briefcase sat between them, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and yet, it was also a chance for them to rewrite the ending. She wanted him to have it, not because of the money, but because it felt like a way to give him back some of the power her family had stolen from him. The man's heart ached with indecision. Could he forgive her? Could he let go of the hatred that had kept him alive for so long? He had lived with the desire for revenge for years, but standing here now, looking into the eyes of the woman who had unknowingly changed his life, he wasn't sure anymore. Vengeance had seemed like the only path forward, but now, forgiveness seemed like the harder, and perhaps more meaningful, choice. To forgive her would mean letting go of the past, something he wasn't sure he was ready to do. But to hold on to the anger would mean continuing to live in the shadows, consumed by a life of pain. The tension built as he weighed his options. The briefcase represented freedom, freedom from the streets, from his past, from the life he had been forced to endure. But did he want that freedom tainted by revenge? The thought of disappearing with the money was tempting, but there was a hollowness to it now. It wouldn't bring him the satisfaction he once thought it would. It wouldn't heal the wounds that ran so deep. As he stood there, the answer began to form in his mind, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet truth that had been there all along. He bent down, picked up the briefcase, and held it out to her. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice low but steady. The woman stared at him in disbelief, her hands trembling as she reached out to take it. She hadn't expected this. She had prepared herself for anger, for rejection, but not for this. The act of giving back the money was more than just a gesture, it was a sign that he was ready to let go of the past. The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lift off his shoulders. The decision to forgive, while not easy, felt like the only path that could lead to true freedom. As the woman accepted the briefcase, tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't deserve this kindness, not after everything that had happened. But she understood that this was more than just an act of forgiveness, it was a chance for both of them to move forward. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words felt inadequate for the enormity of what he had just done, but they were all she had. She didn't know what the future held for either of them, but in this moment, she knew they had both taken a step toward healing. The man nodded, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in years. He had chosen forgiveness, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to truly be free of the pain that had haunted him for so long. As he turned to leave, the weight of the past finally began to fade, replaced by the faint hope of a future he had never thought possible. The woman watched him go, her heart heavy but filled with gratitude. Their paths had crossed in the most unexpected way, and while the scars of the past would remain, they both knew that this was a new beginning. As the man walked away from the woman and the briefcase, a strange sense of lightness washed over him. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of his past had lifted, if only slightly. Choosing forgiveness had been the hardest decision of his life, but it also felt like the first real choice he had made in years. The streets that had once seemed suffocating and cruel now felt different. He had taken his first step towards something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Yet, even as he walked away, he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. There were still scars to heal, wounds that wouldn't close overnight. The woman stood frozen for a moment, watching him disappear into the distance. The briefcase felt heavy in her hands, not because of the money inside, but because of what it symbolized. His gesture had been one of incredible generosity, and she knew she couldn't let it end here. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the years of suffering that had shaped the man he had become. As much as she had been a victim of her father's actions, she knew that she had a chance to change the course of his life, just as he had saved hers. She couldn't leave it at forgiveness alone, she needed to offer him something more. Determined, she made a decision. The next day, she used every resource at her disposal to track him down once again. It wasn't easy, he was used to disappearing, blending into the shadows of the city, but eventually, she found him. This time, it wasn't about settling old debts or uncovering secrets. This time, she came to offer him a future. When she approached him, he was surprised to see her again. His first instinct was to walk away, to keep his distance, but something in her eyes stopped him. There was a sincerity in her gaze, a quiet determination that made him pause. "I want to help you," she said, her voice steady but gentle. The man stared at her, unsure of what to say. He had never asked for help, and the idea of accepting it felt foreign, even uncomfortable. But the woman was persistent. She told him that she couldn't undo what her father had done, but she could offer him a way to rebuild his life. She wasn't offering charity, she was offering a second chance. She spoke of ways she could help him regain his footing, whether it was a job, a place to stay, or simply the support to get back on his feet. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about redemption. At first, the man resisted. His pride wouldn't let him accept her offer so easily. He had lived so long in the shadows that the idea of stepping into the light again felt impossible. But the woman was patient, and as the days passed, he began to see that her offer wasn't out of pity. She genuinely wanted to help him heal, just as he had unknowingly helped her see the truth about her family. Slowly, reluctantly, he accepted. It wasn't about starting over, it was about reclaiming some part of himself that he thought had been lost forever. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he was willing to try. With her help, he found a small apartment, Nothing fancy, but it was a place of his own. He started working again, a modest job that gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Every day, the woman checked in on him, not to monitor his progress, but to offer support. Their relationship evolved, no longer defined by the past but by the shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild. Both of them were healing in their own way, and though the scars of their history remained, they found solace in each other's company. The redemption they sought wasn't just about fixing the mistakes of the past, it was about forging a new path forward, together. The man's transformation wasn't immediate, but with each passing day, he grew stronger. He began to reconnect with the parts of himself he thought had died long ago, the businessman, the father, the friend. Slowly, he began to find a new sense of dignity, not defined by his wealth or status, but by the choices he was making now. The streets that had once been his prison became a distant memory, and though he knew the pain of the past would never fully disappear, he no longer let it control him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future. The woman, too, experienced her own transformation. Helping him had become more than just a way to atone for her father's sins, it had become a journey of self-discovery. She had grown up in a world where power and money seemed to define success, but now, she understood that true worth wasn't measured by material wealth. Through the man's struggles, she learned the value of compassion, humility, and the strength that comes from lifting others up. Their lives, once separated by betrayal and pain, had become intertwined in ways neither of them could have anticipated. As they stood together, looking out at the city that had once seemed so unforgiving, they both realized something important. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about accepting it and finding a way to move forward. The man had forgiven her, and in doing so, had forgiven himself. The woman had sought to make amends, not just for her father's mistakes, but for the way she had lived her own life. In the end, they found peace not through revenge or restitution, but through the quiet, powerful act of rebuilding their lives together. As time passed, the man and the woman settled into their new lives, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. What had begun with a chance encounter in a dark alley had transformed into something far deeper, something neither of them could have predicted. The man, once consumed by bitterness and anger, had learned the true power of forgiveness. By letting go of the resentment that had poisoned his life for so long, he found the strength to rebuild. The woman, on the other hand, had discovered that wealth and status were meaningless without empathy, without understanding the human heart. Their lives, once divided by a legacy of betrayal, were now bound together by something stronger, compassion and redemption. The man had spent years haunted by the actions of the woman's father, but in choosing to forgive, he freed himself from the prison of his own mind. He had discovered that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past, it was about reclaiming his own future. The woman, too, had found freedom in her own way. She had faced the painful truth about her family and made the choice to do better, to live with integrity and kindness. Together, they embodied the idea that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the rest of their lives. The act of forgiveness had sparked a transformation in both of them, not just as individuals, but in their understanding of the world around them. They had learned that healing wasn't a solitary journey, it required connection, vulnerability, and the courage to trust again. Their relationship, once shaped by the weight of the past, had grown into something built on mutual respect and shared hope for the future. The city that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving now felt different. The man, who had once seen only its dark, lonely corners, now walked through its streets with a sense of peace. He had found dignity in his work, purpose in his new life, and, perhaps most importantly, a sense of belonging. The woman, too, had found new meaning in her life. She no longer measured her success by the standards of wealth or power, but by the impact she had on the people around her. Together, they had created something beautiful out of the wreckage of their pasts, something grounded in trust, compassion, and the belief in second chances. Their story was one of transformation, but it was also a reminder of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Both of them had been broken in their own ways, but through forgiveness, they had found the strength to rebuild. The man had once believed that his life was over, that he would forever be defined by the betrayal that had ruined him. But in choosing to forgive, he discovered that life could begin again, even in the most unexpected ways. The woman, too, had found a new sense of purpose, a desire to live a life that honored not just her own potential, but the humanity of others. As they stood together, reflecting on the paths that had brought them here, they both realized something profound. Forgiveness had given them back their lives. It had allowed them to let go of the pain that had held them captive for so long and had opened the door to a future they never thought possible. In forgiving each other, they had forgiven themselves, and in doing so, they had found the peace they had both been searching for. The story ended not with a grand gesture or a dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet sense of hope. The man and the woman, once strangers bound by tragedy, had become allies in their own redemption. They knew that the future wouldn't be without its challenges, but they also knew that they had the strength to face whatever came next. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that even in the darkest moments, forgiveness could light the way forward, offering the chance for healing, transformation, and, ultimately, peace. You've just witnessed an incredible story of forgiveness, redemption, and the power of second chances. But this is only the beginning. The next chapter is right around the corner, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. What happens next might just be the most unexpected twist yet. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now, and dive into the next emotional journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss out on these gripping stories. And while you're at it, let us know in the comments what you thought of this story. Did it move you? What would you have done in their shoes? We can't wait to hear from you.